1901, to marry his mistress, a 71-year-old tycoon didn't just get a divorce. He had an entire state rewrite its marriage laws just for him. Newspapers across the country exploded. They screamed of corruption, portrayed him as a lecherous old man, but he didn't apologize. His response was a palace, not just a house, but a $4 million wedding gift designed to dazzle America and silence everyone. But today, we'll reveal not how he built it, but what he built it with. And you'll be surprised how much this 120-year-old tactic resembles the PR strategies of modern-day billionaires. Because this palace was built with money from a scheme that today would be called state-sponsored racketeering. And the most chilling part is that his competitors, without even knowing it, personally paid for every stone in its walls. This is Whitehall, the Pearl of Palm Beach, a National Historic Landmark, a palace they call America's Taj Mahal, an anthem to the Gilded Age cast in white marble. Every year, thousands of people pass through its massive bronze gates to touch a legend. They see grandeur, harmony, a dream made real. But this palace was not built on love, but on a ruthless monopoly. Its story begins not with tender feelings, but with war. A war for the black gold that seethed in the depths of Pennsylvania. Its foundation is not stone, but a scheme called the drawback. A brilliant and cynical system that forced competitors to pay for their own destruction. Every elegant column in this building, every gilded cornice, was paid for with money from the Standard Oil Company. A company that cartoonists depicted as a giant octopus whose tentacles were strangling the American economy. And the man who was the brain of this operation, the quiet, devout architect of the monopoly, was Henry Morrison Flagler. To many of his contemporaries, he was not a creator. He was a destroyer. The journalist Ida Tarbell, who dedicated her life to exposing his empire, called his methods commercial Machiavellianism. He didn't just compete. He wiped entire companies off the map, bankrupted families, and rewrote the laws of the market to suit himself. And yet, decades later, here on this land reclaimed from the Florida swamps, stands his creation. It has outlived its creator, his scandals, his fame, and his infamy. It has survived neglect and the threat of demolition. And it was saved by his own granddaughter, Jean Flagler Matthews, a woman who looked at these walls and saw something more than a monument to predatory capital. She saw a beauty worth saving. This is the central paradox of Whitehall. How did a creation born of cynicism and exorbitant ambition become a national treasure that we are now obligated to protect? Can beauty atone for its origins? And whose story, in the end, is more important? The man who built these walls, or the building itself, which has learned to tell a very different story? To understand Whitehall, you must first understand the money that built it. This was not the money of the old aristocracy, inherited over generations. This was new money, hard, fast, smelling of crude oil and steel, money pumped from the ground and from the pockets of competitors with equal efficiency. It all began with a simple idea: light. The kerosene lamp, which replaced the candle. The Standard Oil Company, founded by John D. Rockefeller and Henry Flagler, promised to bring this light to every American home. But behind that clean, bright flame hid the darkest business practices the country had ever seen. Flagler was the quiet genius of this system. He didn't shout on stock exchanges or pose for newspapers. He worked with numbers and contracts. His first weapon was the discount, the rebate. He would go to railroad owners and say, "We will give you so much oil that you can fill all your trains. In return, you will give us a secret rate, much lower than anyone else's." The railroads agreed. Standard Oil's competitors would suddenly find that shipping their barrels cost twice or even 3 times as much. They were already losing before the fight even began. But that was just the start. The pinnacle of Flagler's cynicism was the drawback scheme. Now, he demanded from the railroads not only a discount for himself, but also a share of the amount his enemies paid. Imagine, every barrel of oil shipped by an independent producer not only brought profit to the railroad, but also filled Standard Oil's war chest. Flagler's competitors, without even knowing it, were paying tribute to their own executioner. This wasn't commerce. It was a war of attrition, waged in ledgers and on railway tracks. Across the map of America, region by region, Standard Oil carried out price purges. Kerosene prices would be slashed until the local refinery was on the brink of bankruptcy. And then, Flagler's agents would appear and buy it up for a pittance. Espionage, bribery, pressure, everything was used. In 1882, this scattered empire was organized into America's first trust. About 40 companies merged into a single organism that controlled 90% of all American oil. Flagler didn't just ship oil cheaper. He created a system where his enemies paid him for the right to exist, right up until he strangled them. This money, saturated with the smell of oil and the bitterness of other people's bankruptcies, was now seeking a new purpose. It had already built an industrial empire. Now, it was destined to build a dynasty. Every dollar squeezed from the Pennsylvanian oilmen, every cent obtained through the drawback scheme, became an invisible brick in the foundation of a future palace. A palace for a man who saw the world as an arena where only the strongest survive, and was determined to prove it. The greatest architectural declarations are often born from the deepest personal wounds. Whitehall, for all its splendor, is no exception. Its story is not of one marriage, but 3. A story of love, madness, and the unbending will of one man. The first was Mary Harkness, a quiet, sickly woman. It was her fragile health, her tuberculosis, that first brought Henry Flagler to Florida. He saw this land through her eyes, as a final refuge, as a hope. But she died, leaving him alone with his memories and the first vague idea of what this wild land could become. The second was Ida Alice. His marriage to her became his personal hell. In 1895, doctors diagnosed her with incurable insanity. She locked herself away in a world of illusions, imagining herself the wife of the Russian Tsar and speaking to spirits through a Ouija board. Flagler placed her in a sanatorium, but under Florida law, he was forever bound to this ghost. Divorce on the grounds of insanity was impossible. And then there was the third, Mary Lily Kenan, young, full of life, 37 years his junior. The 71-year-old magnate, who had built an empire, was ready to do anything to start a new life with her. But the law stood in his way. And so, Flagler did what he did best. He used capital as a battering ram. He didn't ask. He compelled. The full weight of his political influence, his entire fortune, was brought to bear on the state legislature. In 1901, a law was passed that the press immediately dubbed the Flagler Divorce Law. It permitted the dissolution of a marriage if one spouse was declared incurably insane. Newspapers across the country erupted. They screamed of corruption, of how the aging octopus of Standard Oil had bought himself the right to lust. And Whitehall was his answer. Not an apology, not an explanation, but a thunderous declaration. It wasn't just a wedding gift for Mary Lily. It was an act of defiance, a challenge thrown down to the entire world. It was as if he were saying, "You call me immoral? I will build a palace that will silence European monarchs. You whisper about my bride? I will crown her in halls the likes of which America has never seen. The choice of architects, Carrère and Hastings, and the Beaux-Arts style, this was not a matter of taste. It was ideological weaponry. The Beaux-Arts style, with its references to Greek temples and French palaces, was a way for America's nouveau riche to buy themselves a pedigree. Every stone in this wall was a share invested in his own legitimacy. Flagler imported European history wholesale to affirm his unofficial title, the King of Florida. He built his fortress to protect his marriage from the world's judgment. But he failed to consider that the greatest threat would come not from without, but from within. The story of Whitehall is not one of contemplative creation. It is a story of battle, a battle against time, against nature, against reality itself. When Henry Flagler gave an order, he didn't ask if it was possible. He demanded it be done. The task set before the architects, Carrère and Hastings, sounded like madness. A palace of 100,000 square feet, larger than any private home in the South, was to be built, finished, and furnished in 18 months. It had to be ready for the 1902 winter social season, not a day later. The clock began its merciless countdown, and the first thing the builders confronted was the site itself. In 1900, Palm Beach was nothing more than a narrow strip of sand between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth, a swampy, isolated barrier island, cut off from the mainland. There was nothing here. No roads, no warehouses, no skilled labor. Everything, absolutely everything, had to be brought in from the outside. Every beam, every bag of cement, every nail, and there was only one way to do it, along the single railway line owned by Flagler himself. His own railroad, his monopoly on transport, now became the bottleneck for his own ambitious project. It was a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. Trains coming from the north carried steel from Pittsburgh and lumber from Georgia. Ships crossing the Atlantic delivered marble from Italy and roof tiles from Spain. This entire torrent of materials had to converge at a single point in the middle of nowhere amidst the Florida swamps and be transformed into a palace. For Carrère and Hastings, this was more than just a commission. It was a test of their genius, their reputation, their ability to manage chaos. They understood they weren't working for a client, but for a force of nature, for a man accustomed to moving mountains and diverting rivers, and who expected the same from them. The deadline wasn't just tight, it was impossible, and that made the challenge all the more compelling. The race against time had begun. Flagler could control railroads and legislators, but he could not control the sky. Almost as soon as it began, the construction faced an enemy far more ancient and powerful than any business competitor. It faced Florida's nature itself. Here, in the subtropics, the air was thick and heavy. The humidity reached 100%, and the debilitating heat lingered for months. For the hundreds of workers who had come from the north, it was hell on earth. Men collapsed from heat stroke, their bodies refusing to function in this humid inferno. Every hammer swing, every stone lifted, required superhuman effort. And then came the clouds. Not life-giving rain clouds, but living, buzzing swarms of mosquitoes rising from the swamps. They carried malaria and yellow fever, invisible killers that could halt construction faster than any storm. But the greatest threat was the hurricanes. Every year, from summer to late fall, the construction site lived under a sword of Damocles. Archived weather maps from those years show a succession of storms forming in the Atlantic and heading straight for the Florida coast. One strike from the elements, and months of titanic labor could be washed into the ocean. Every gust of wind made hearts stop. Even the earth resisted. The sandy, flood-prone soil of the barrier island refused to bear the weight of the future palace. Before the walls could be raised, a separate engineering war had to be waged, driving hundreds of piles into the unstable ground to create a solid foundation. It was in this battle with nature that the most ingenious architectural solutions were born. Carrere and Hastings realized it was useless to fight the climate. It had to be tamed. Thus, the enormous central atrium, open to the sky, was conceived. It was not merely a decorative element. It was the lungs of this building. It drew in the slightest breeze from the ocean, creating natural ventilation that cooled the gigantic house from the inside. It was a tactical concession to nature, a way to make it work for the building, not against it. Whitehall was not simply built in defiance of nature. It learned to breathe with it. Behind the elegant facade of a Greek temple, behind all that European gilt, lay Whitehall's true essence. An essence that was American, industrial, and uncompromising. Before the first piece of marble arrived on site, the skeleton of a monster rose above the palm trees and swamps. 386 tons of Pittsburgh steel, beams, rivets, trusses, brought by rail directly from the smoking mills of Andrew Carnegie. This was the building's spine, its hidden truth. While Flagler dreamed of the palace of a European aristocrat, his engineers were erecting a skyscraper simply laid on its side. This steel was a symbol of the New World. It spoke not of ancient dynasties, but of the power of blast furnaces, of the force of capital that could smelt ore and reshape landscapes. We see it in rare construction photos, steelworkers balancing on narrow beams at dizzying heights, with no safety equipment. Their faces are tense, their clothes soaked with sweat. It was dirty, dangerous, brutal work. Here, in this steel frame, two worlds collided: American industrial might and European aesthetic tradition. This was the skeleton of a modern titan, soon to be draped in an ancient toga. The contrast was stark, the roar of riveting hammers echoing over the tropical island, and the silence that would one day reign in the Renaissance-style library built within that frame. This steel allowed the architects to think on a grand scale, to create vast, open spaces like the ballroom and the marble hall, which would have been unthinkable with traditional construction methods. It was the invisible force that held up the full weight of Flagler's ambitions. Every pound of this metal was paid for with Standard Oil money, another product of the Industrial Revolution, now giving birth to a new one. Whitehall was not just a home, it was a machine, and this steel skeleton was its engine, hidden from sight, but defining everything. Henry Flagler wasn't just building a house in Florida. He was committing an act of cultural conquest. Having no ancestral history of his own stretching back for centuries, he decided to simply buy someone else's. All of it, all at once. While the steel frame was rising over Palm Beach, ships laden with the past were already sailing across the Atlantic. It was a veritable operation to import legitimacy. From the Carrara quarries in Italy, the very ones where Michelangelo once sourced his stone, came tons of snow-white marble for the Grand Hall. From crumbling French chateaux, antique tapestries and boiserie panels were bought up. From English estates, furniture that remembered generations of lords and earls was acquired at auction. Flagler assembled his palace like a collector pins butterflies, plucking the most beautiful specimens from different eras and continents. He wasn't creating a new style. He was appropriating old ones. Every room in Whitehall became a theatrical set, a portal to another era. Entering the music room, a guest would find themselves at the court of Louis XV. Crossing the threshold of the library, they were transported to a Florentine Renaissance palazzo, and dinner was served in the dining room, decorated in the heavy, majestic style of the English Tudors. This was not subtle stylization. This was boastfulness, cast in bronze and carved from wood. Every object within these walls screamed of the money that was paid for it. It was the ultimate act of consumption. Flagler wasn't just consuming things, he was consuming history itself. He was declaring to the entire world, I, the son of a poor clergyman from New York State, am so wealthy that I can buy the past, pack it into crates, and place it here in my personal paradise, built in the middle of a swamp. Whitehall was becoming a museum even before it was finished, a museum to one man's power over time and space. But behind this facade hid an unsettling emptiness. A house assembled from other people's memories risked never acquiring any of its own. In the history of Whitehall, the names of the architects and the owner are carved in stone. But who actually built this palace? By whose hands was every piece of marble lifted, every nail driven, every cubic meter of mortar mixed? The answer, an invisible army. 1,000 men whose names history has all but erased. They came from everywhere. Irish immigrants fleeing famine, Italian stonecutters whose ancestors had built cathedrals, local Florida laborers accustomed to the heat, and African Americans from the South looking for any kind of wage. They were the fuel for this giant construction machine. Their lives had nothing in common with the luxury they were creating. They lived in temporary barracks, nailed together from rough planks, far from the glittering construction site. They slept on hard bunks, suffering from the heat and mosquitoes. Their existence was harsh and simple. Every one of their days was a battle. At dawn, they would go to the construction site, where grueling 12-hour labor awaited them under the scorching sun. The high steel workers risked their lives, scrambling up the steel frame without safety harnesses. Masons spent hours inhaling marble dust, which destroyed their lungs. Carpenters and plasterers worked at a frantic pace to meet the incredible deadlines set by a man they had perhaps never even seen. Their labor was a cost that couldn't be found in the official $4 million budget. What was the cost of broken backs, heat strokes, diseases brought from the swamps? We don't know. In the few letters that survive with their descendants, we can only read echoes of this life. Complaints about meager pay, bad food, and longing for home. They were the nameless soldiers in Flagler's war for status. Their sweat mixed with the cement in the foundation. Their calloused hands polished the marble that would later be touched only by hands in white gloves. They were creating a paradise for others while living on its fringes. When the last worker left the island, their tracks quickly vanished. But without their silent, titanic labor, Whitehall would have forever remained just a blueprint on paper, the unfulfilled dream of an oil tycoon. Beneath the gilding and silk, behind the mahogany panels and French tapestries, beat the second, hidden heart of Whitehall. It was the heart of a machine. Flagler's palace wasn't just a beautiful shell. It was one of the most technologically advanced organisms of its time. In an era when electricity was still a luxury in many cities, Whitehall was fully electrified. Miles of copper wire, hidden in the walls, powered hundreds of light bulbs that lit up with the flick of a switch. But Flagler didn't trust the local grid. He built a separate building next to the mansion, his own power plant, which made his palace completely autonomous, an independent island of light in the midst of the Florida coast's nightly darkness. Connection to the world was provided by 21 telephone lines. That was more than in the rest of the city of Palm Beach combined. Flagler could, without leaving his study, manage his railroad empire, give orders to brokers in New York, or simply summon a servant from a distant part of the house. It was the building's nervous system, extending its threads into every corner. But the true marvel of engineering was the plumbing system. A separate pumping station supplied water to the palace's 19 bathrooms, and not just any water. Each faucet offered a choice of 4 options: hot and cold fresh water for washing, and hot and cold salt water from the ocean for therapeutic baths. This was an unheard-of luxury, a demonstration of man's absolute power over the elements. Whitehall was not just a house, it was a self-sufficient city-state. With its own power plant, waterworks, telephone exchange, and an entire ground floor that housed kitchens, laundries, and rooms for dozens of servants who ensured the machine's seamless operation. These technological innards were as much of a statement as the marble facade. It said, "I am not just copying the past, I am controlling the future." Flagler created not just a dwelling, but a perfectly tuned mechanism for living, a technological oasis in the midst of wild nature. He proved that his money could buy not only history, but also the most advanced comfort civilization had ever known. While thousands of hands were raising the walls of Whitehall, Henry Flagler was waging another, equally important war, a war unseen, but fierce, a battle for his own name. It was fought not on the construction site, but in the pages of newspapers all across America. Ink was his enemy's weapon. While workers laid Italian marble, cartoonists depicted Flagler as a depraved old man buying himself a young wife. While plasterers applied gold leaf, headlines screamed that the Florida legislature had sold its honor for Standard Oil money. The Flagler divorce law became a symbol of corruption, a stain on his reputation that no tropical downpour could wash away. He understood that mere silence wasn't enough. He needed a counterattack, and Whitehall became his main weapon in this PR war. Flagler and his agents began to methodically leak information to the press about the grandiose construction. They were trying to shift the focus of public attention, to distract from the scandalous divorce and draw it towards the majestic creation. Every article about the palace was a carefully calculated shot. Newspapers wrote with delight about the thousands of tons of steel, the shiploads of marble, the unprecedented luxury. They weren't telling a story of questionable morals, but an epic of a man bringing civilization to the wilds of Florida, of a pioneer tycoon building not just a house, but a symbol of progress and the American dream. Whitehall ceased to be just a building. It became an argument, tangible physical proof of Flagler's creative, not destructive power. He was, in effect, telling the nation, "Look not at my personal affairs, but at what I create. I build hotels, railroads, cities. I turn swamps into gardens." This palace was to be his indulgence, carved in stone. It was a risky game. The more grandiose the palace became, the louder the accusations of hubris grew. But Flagler had placed his bet. He believed that in an America obsessed with success, visible greatness would ultimately always triumph over invisible moral qualms. His palace was meant to blind the critics, to silence them in the face of the undeniable fact of his power. As construction neared its end, 2 final symbolic acts remained. They were not about steel or marble. They were about soul and boundaries, the palace's voice and its shield. The first was the voice. In the immense ballroom, designed for the most lavish receptions, workers began to install a giant organ. This was no mere musical toy. It was a complex mechanism of 1,249 pipes, from tiny ones the size of a pencil to enormous ones several meters high. It was commissioned from one of the finest firms in the country. Installing this instrument was akin to assembling a room-sized clockwork mechanism. This organ was to become the soul of Whitehall. Its sounds, from the gentle whisper of a flute to the thunderous roar of the pipes, were meant to fill the space, to animate the cold marble, to transform museum-like halls into a living home. The music was to be the final, finishing touch, breathing life into this gigantic body. The second was the shield. At the same time, massive bronze gates were being installed at the main entrance. They weighed several tons. Their design, austere and majestic, was copied from the gates of a European palazzo. They were not just an entrance, they were a barrier. These gates were designed to inspire awe and to clearly separate two worlds. Behind them, the orderly, luxurious, controlled universe of Henry Flagler. In front of them, the rest of the world, chaotic, noisy, curious. One could only pass through them by invitation. They were the physical embodiment of his status, his exclusivity. And so, in these two final gestures, the entire essence of the project was revealed. On the one hand, Flagler filled his world with exquisite beauty and music. On the other, he walled himself off from everyone who did not belong to his circle. The construction concluded with these two acts: the creation of an inner voice and the erection of an outer wall. The palace had found its soul and closed itself off from the world. December 1901. The countdown is almost complete. 18 months of titanic labor, soaked in sweat, cement dust, and ambition, are coming to an end. The construction site is an atmosphere of feverish, controlled chaos. These are the final weeks before the deadline. Dozens of workers, no longer builders but master finishers, are working day and night. Teams of polishers are on their knees in the main hall, bringing the floors of 7 types of marble to a mirror shine. Their movements are precise, methodical, as if they are erasing the last traces of construction dirt to reveal the stone's pristine beauty to the world. In the halls, master cabinet makers are installing the last of the carved panels, fitting them with millimeter precision. Upholsterers are hanging the finest silk fabrics on the walls. From enormous crates, smelling of the sea and distant lands, decorators are unpacking paintings, tapestries, porcelain, and over all of it, the unseen presence of the master. Henry Flagler, now in his 70s, personally inspects every corner. He walks through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He checks every detail, every latch, every gilded rosette. His gaze is that of a creator assessing his creation. For him, this is not just a house. It is a culmination, the material embodiment of his entire life, his struggle, his victory. And then, the moment comes. The last worker leaves. The last crate is unpacked. The last polishing cloth is put away. 18 months have passed. The palace is ready. The camera slowly glides through the empty, gleaming halls on the night before the first ball. Moonlight filters through the high windows, glides across marble columns, reflects in the crystal chandeliers. Silence. A deep, ringing silence before the storm. The air is electric with anticipation. The palace holds its breath. The impossible has been achieved. In the middle of the Florida swamps, on a patch of sand, a monument to one man's will has risen. The machine for living is fueled and ready to launch. Tomorrow, its halls will be filled with music, laughter, and the rustle of gowns. But on this last night of silence, Whitehall belongs only to itself. It has been born. February 6th, 1902. The grand gates of Whitehall are thrown open. A line of carriages stretches towards them. From them emerge people whose names are synonymous with American wealth and power. Rockefellers, Astors, Vanderbilts. The entire financial aristocracy of the Gilded Age has converged on Florida to see the miracle built by Henry Flagler. The newspapers would call this evening the Whitehall Ball, the greatest social event in the history of the American South. For Flagler, it was a triumph. He wasn't just receiving guests, he was showing them his trophy, his answer to all the critics. The organ music thundered in the ballroom, champagne flowed like a river, and thousands of candles reflected in the marble. He showed the world that his money could buy not only a divorce, but also universal admiration. But behind the dazzling splendor hid a cold, uncomfortable truth. Whitehall never became a real home. It was too big, too grand, too formal. It was a theater, a stage for displaying status. Life here flowed for only 6, maybe 8 weeks a year during the short winter season. The rest of the time, the palace stood empty, submerged in silence and the humid Florida heat, guarded only by a staff of servants. It was so enormous that even to its inhabitants, it remained a foreign place. Upon arrival, each guest was handed a special booklet with a floor plan so they wouldn't get lost in the endless corridors and enfilades of its 75 rooms. This was not a dwelling, but a labyrinth of silk and marble. And at the center of this labyrinth was Mary Lily, the woman for whom it was all built. What did she feel within these walls? Was it a dream come true for her? Or did this staggering luxury, this $4 million wedding gift, eventually become the most beautiful, most expensive gilded cage in the world? We will never know. But the walls remember. They remember both the brief splendor and the long, deafening loneliness that followed. March 1913. Henry Flagler is 83. He is a living legend. The man who built an oil empire, conquered the wilds of Florida, bent the state's laws to his will, and erected a palace without equal. He seemed indestructible, as eternal as the monoliths from which his world was built. But fate did not strike on the stock exchange or in a courtroom. It struck here, in the heart of his own creation. One ordinary day, while descending the main marble staircase of Whitehall, the old man missed a step. A simple, mundane, absurd fall. His body, weakened by age, crashed onto the cold, polished steps. That moment was fatal. The iron magnate, who had outlasted economic rivals, political enemies, and even assassination attempts, was defeated by his own home. The staircase, designed for triumphant entrances, became the site of his downfall. The marble, brought from Italy as a symbol of eternity, proved to be hard and merciless. Flagler never recovered from his injuries. He died a few months later. His death marked the end of an era. He was gone, leaving behind the largest fortune in Florida's history and the richest widow in America, Mary Lily. But the tragedy of Whitehall did not end there. It only changed its setting. Mary Lily, who suddenly became the mistress of an immense fortune, remarried, but her new happiness was short-lived. Just a year after her wedding, in 1917, she died under mysterious circumstances that remain unexplained to this day. Her own family was convinced it was poisoning. And so, in a series of falls and deaths, the short history of the Flagler dynasty at Whitehall came to an end. The palace, built as a symbol of new life, became a witness to its tragic finale. Its creator and its queen were gone. But the walls remained, orphaned, silent, holding the memory of the splendor and the darkness they had seen. The era was over. A palace without its king is doomed to a slow death. Deprived of its creator, Whitehall began to fade. It was sold to a group of investors who saw not history in it, but square footage. In 1925, a monstrous 10-story hotel tower was added to its flawless facade, an ugly scar on the face of the Gilded Age. Inside, the plundering began. The original rooms were partitioned, turned into featureless hotel suites. The priceless furniture, which remembered the Flaglers' grand balls, was sold off at auctions or simply broken. The majestic marble hall was covered with a worn-out carpet, and the open-air courtyard, a brilliant creation of the architects, was crudely enclosed in glass, depriving the building of its breath. By 1959, Whitehall was a bankrupt ghost. Dirty, neglected, it was living out its final days. The sentence had been passed: demolition. A new, modern resort was to rise in its place. The monument to Flagler's ambition was to be turned into a pile of rubble. And then, a miracle happens. Henry Flagler's granddaughter, Jean Flagler Matthews, a woman who never knew her grandfather, happens to see a tiny notice in the newspaper about the upcoming demolition. And at that moment, history takes a sharp turn. Jean, driven by a sense of duty to her family's legacy, decides to act. She creates a non-profit foundation, makes the first contribution from her own money, and convinces other heirs to help her. A desperate race against time begins to buy the palace back from the developers, and she succeeds. But saving it is only half the battle. Jean sets herself a titanic task, not just to preserve the ruins, but to restore Whitehall to its original 1902 appearance. The ugly hotel wing is torn down with a deafening roar. Meticulous, years-long restoration work begins. A worldwide search is launched for the original furniture, tapestries, and paintings. Master restorers, layer by layer, remove the traces of decades of decay. And then, in 1960, Whitehall is born for a second time. But now, its massive bronze gates open not for a select few, but for everyone. And herein lies the final, greatest paradox of this story. The palace, built as the ultimate symbol of elitism, as an impregnable fortress of private power, survived only because it became public property. Its walls no longer hide the secrets of a monopolist. Now, they tell a complex, contradictory story of boundless American ambition, of its price, and of the completely unpredictable, uncontrollable nature of legacy. The creation outlived its creator and found a meaning he could never have imagined. And so, the story of Whitehall comes full circle in all its paradox. The palace, born from the cynicism of a monopoly and a personal scandal, built as an impregnable fortress for one man, survived only because it became a treasure for all. Its walls, erected as an argument in a private war, learned to tell a story far more complex and eternal than the one its creator intended. And looking at its flawless facade, we are left with the main question: can beauty redeem its origins? And what, in the end, proves more durable? The reputation of a man, or the silent truth of the stone that outlasted him? The story of Whitehall isn't over. It continues in everyone who tries to make sense of it. Share your thoughts in the comments and support our channel so we can continue telling stories.